Good day everyone and welcome to this year's PvP set tier list, so for 2024. In this video I want to share the sets, the 5-piece sets specifically, that I frequently think of when I make a build. The sets that I think are just the best in stat density or that give me the most value with a proc set for example, and also keeping in account the sets that are the most popular right now in PvP. With so many sets around, I think a list like this is useful to help you theory crafting your own build. I want to give some inspiration with sets that you might not have thought of, or I want to give some explanation on sets that I'm not using as much as maybe other people, and I want to tell you why that is as well. I am making this list for varying PvP modes, so not only solo PvP, but I'm also keeping battlegrounds into account, duels, and also group PvP, anything from loosely organized small scales to more organized kind of ball group PvP. Also different other kinds of gameplay such as ganking and bombing is what I want to include in this list. And since it's about the best sets, I'm not going to go over any of the lower tiers in the classic tier list. I'm going to start out with the B tier and then move on to the A tier and the S tier. So the best sets I think are around. And so with this introduction out of the way, I'm going to start with the B tier, which in my opinion are sets that are almost good enough for me to consider for a build, but they lack just a little bit in stat density, or they might just be simply outperformed by another set later on in the list. And the first two sets that I want to mention here are War Maiden and Dagon's Dominion. These two sets are simple front bar buff sets for some specific specs that use a lot of magical damage like Magplar, in which case you can use War Maiden, or that do a lot of AoE damage like a Warden DD in an organized group. I think they have a value, they have definitely a stat dense 5-piece bonus, so they are worth considering, but often they are outperformed by more complicated sets later on. The next set is New Moon Acolyte. This is also a simple front bar set like before, but unlike the previous two sets, this can be used on many different specs, and it used to be meta at some point as well some years ago, but because of all the new sets that have been released, it kind of got power crept, and it also still has a small drawback with the 5% increased cost to your abilities. Next up is Oakfather's Retribution. This is a rather new set that I think is a little bit underrated, so I did want to include it in the list. Basically, this is going to give you damage to a single enemy depending on how many buffs that he has. To give you a bit of an example to show how much power it has, let's assume that an enemy has the 3 regeneration buffs, for example from a tripod. So you have major intellect, major endurance and major fortitude. Then you also have major sorcery and brutality from any skill that gives that. Major prophecy and savagery, also very common. Major resolve, every build should have that. And then assuming also 2 other random major buffs, like for example major vitality or major mending, is definitely also common to encounter these two, especially with the new scribing system out. And with that you have about 10 major buffs, and if you look at this set, this is going to give you about 4.5k pen against a single enemy. And then assuming a similar amount of minor buffs, you also get about 150 to 200 spell damage against that enemy. This will definitely fluctuate if you fight players that are not as good, that don't keep their buffs up as much, or that don't have a good build. You won't get as much value out of the set. But if you fight really good players that often have a bunch more buffs, this is definitely going to go up in value. And in the end, it is quite a bit of damage. 4.5k pen and about 200 spell and weapon damage is not bad. So I do want to include it in this list as a possible front bar damage set. Next up is Heartland Conqueror. This is also an old set, a craftable set that is pretty frequently used. Its bonus is also not that bad. I most often see it being used with the charge trait to give a lot of extra stats effect chance, or with the sharpen trait to give a lot of extra penetration. And it can also be double bar to then give more healing on the back bar. But it's not particularly strong compared to other sets that you can also one bar. Even if you want to double bar a set, there are better options that will be down later in the list, be it for healing or for your offensive capabilities. So while it's definitely a good beginner set as it is craftable, I think it is definitely outperformed later on, so I don't use it much. Then we have Griffin's Ferocity. Griffin's Ferocity used to be a pretty good backbar buff set. It gives Minor Force and Minor Expedition, which are both just decently nice buffs to have, but these days Minor Force is really easy to get with other means such as Race Against Time, and then just having Minor Expedition for a 5-piece is not worth it, especially because it is directly outperformed by, for example, Phoenix Moth Touch, which is a set that I will go over in a bit as well. Spinners and Spriggan are very similar sets. They are very old sets as well from base game, and they are just straightforward front bar penetration sets. They're simple and they're not bad. I mean, penetration is also a good stat to have, but these sets are not that stat dense in the end. In nocp cyrodiil, they might be worth considering, but anything in CP cyrodiil should use something else than Spinners and Spriggan, simply because there are other sets that have higher stat density and will just give you more damage. Next up is Armor Plasm and Eternal Vigor. These are the first two real sustain sets that you can get, and these are mostly listed here because of nocp, where if you want to have a set, a double bar set that gives you a bunch of extra sustain, these are the sets to look at. I think in general sustain is easy to get in a lot of different ways as well, and in CP these sets are directly outperformed by Rage Vitality, so it doesn't go any higher than this here on the listing, but I do want to go over it. Night Mortal's Gaze is a decently popular set that gives you Major Breach, which is a really good debuff to have, but in my opinion it really is preferred to use Elemental Susceptibility if you can, instead of sacrificing a 5-piece. Elemental Susceptibility in itself is also a really good skill. It is free, it's going to apply status effects and then also the valuable Major Breach debuff. But in case you're really struggling on bar space, for example due to the scribing system, it's worth looking at Night Mortal's Gaze to front bar that and to see if this can help you free up a bar slot which you could then use for another valuable skill. Next up is Tariqer's Strike. This is also a relatively new set which is going to give you Major Berserk after heavy attacking. It can be used if you have the opportunity to set up a burst and to have it deal more damage with, for example, a duel with heavy attack or something else that you want. But the problem with this set really is that even though Major Berserk is really valuable to have, having a heavy attack in your rotation every time is often not optimal, because it takes a long time to charge up. Heavy attacks also don't deal that much damage anymore, which makes this set interesting on paper because Major Berserk is nice, but often not optimal in actual gameplay. Then I have two not really similar sets, but they have the same purpose, which is Hist Sap and Mara's Balm. These two sets are here to compensate for healing if you lack it in your build, with Hist Sap giving a solid healing over time and Mara's Balm also giving you healing over time with a purge as well every now and then. It's nice to crack up your survivability and your healing if you lack healing, like I said, but the problem is with these sets that there is a lot of healing options in the game right now, especially with scribing. Skills like Vigor are super easy to get, and I feel like you never really need these sets to have even more healing, because it is pretty easy to get a good amount of healing, and I would rather invest into survivability, as in with resistances, rather than in pure healing numbers when it comes to slotting a set. Deadlands Demolisher is a bit of a difficult one for me to list, because it's an S tier set if you want any kind of bashing builds, but the problem is that it is very limited to that and nothing else, and bashing builds are something that I don't see much at all. I only really ever see it on some Arcanist builds, and every now and then there is an old school Stam Decay that wants to use a bash build as well, but other than that I rarely see it being used. So even though it is S tier for those specific purposes, I'm going to keep it in B tier overall, simply because of how few its applications are. Plague Slinger is, I think, a bit of an underrated set. It has actually a pretty good tooltip. It's a pressure proc set, which is going to deal a bunch of constant damage in small procs to a single enemy. It's actually some of the highest pressure proc sets in the game, but the problem with this is that you cannot aim it at a single enemy, which means that in any kind of open world or battleground situation, you risk having it go to random people that you did not want to go on, not the same person that you are focusing. But if you fight in a lower amount of numbers, this can be valuable to have. So I want to list it here as well. Next up I have two ganking sets, which are Antalmir's Cinders and Flame Blossom. They're quite similar in how they work. They are proc sets, which are best used in melee range, and then after a short delay after you attack, you're going to have a pretty high tooltip hitting your enemy. They're not my favorite gank sets though, because you are forced in using melee and because it has a little delay, which means that your target does have a bit of a window to react before the set is going to hit. I don't like that, but I have to admit that these are good ganking sets in the end and worth considering if you are making a ganking build specifically. Now we have Critical Riposte. Critical Riposte is basically a lightweight rallying cry. It's going to give you a 10% crit damage reduction, and it's craftable, which is nice, but in terms of the stats that it gives, on the 5-piece, it's by far not as strong as Rallying Cry, which is going to give you 25% crit damage reduction, about that, and is going to also give you some weapon and spell damage on top of that. So if you're looking for some kind of lightweight version of Rallying Cry, you could look at that, but other than that, you can just get Rallying Cry. Birth of the Swift is a very basic double bar damage reduction set. In my opinion, it's outperformed by another set later on. So if you're looking for some extra survivability, it is worth slotting, but in my opinion it is outperformed by another similar set later on, and on top of that you're also forced in some light armor, which is not always ideal. That said, in nocp this set is worth considering. And then as last on the list for the B tier, I have again two sets, Arcasis and Drake's Rush. These are two similar sets that is going to give ultimate regeneration to your group members when you are running in a small group. I think it's worth considering if you are making a support build for small scale cyrodiil or for battlegrounds, because ults are often a very important part of the burst that you're going to coordinate as a group. So if you have more ults, you have more opportunities to get a good burst going. These two sets are quite limited to this specific purpose though, so while I think they're good sets and they're worth considering, I'm not going to put it any higher than B tier because of how specific they are, a bit similar to how I listed Deadlands Demolisher earlier. Now for the A tier sets. In this tier I'm going to list 5-piece sets that I use occasionally, quite often in conjunction with an S tier set later on, but these are really sets that I start to consider for any kind of build that I make. And the first one in the list here is Kinmaster's Cruelty. Kinmaster's Cruelty is a set mostly used in solo or outnumbered PvP in small groups, which is going to give a variety of good debuffs to the enemy. There's definitely a luck factor in there, which is a drawback in my opinion of the set. It is not as on command as you would like to have a strong debuff like Major Vulnerability for example, but it's still valuable to have, and if you have one person run that in a small group for example, or if you have the room to slot something like this yourself, it's going to give a noticeable extra amount of damage that you deal to the enemies. Then we have Deadly. Deadly Strike is similar to some of the B tier sets where it is a straightforward front bar buff set. But the reason I'm slotting this one in A tier while I have most of the others in B tier is because this one is more stat dense. That makes it one of the best front bar options to dot builds and for example Templar, but it is also limited to these builds that have a lot of channeled or damage over time abilities. Next up is Olorime, or rather Perfected Olorime, which is even better of course. This is a backbar buff set. It's not as strong as some of the other backbar buff sets later on the list in my opinion, but it's really not that far behind because Major Courage is a strong buff to have, and if you have a class or a spec that can proc this regularly, you'll have 100% uptime on this. For example, a DK with Cinderstorm or a Templar with its runes has no problem keeping the set up. And on top of that, it's also going to go to other players. So if you're looking for a small group buff set for a good amount of extra damage, this is something you should consider. Clever Alchemist is a very old set and craftable as well, but despite so many other sets coming out since this was released, it's still really good for setting up a high amount of weapon and spell damage for your burst. There's few other sets that actually even give that much weapon or spell damage on their 5-piece bonus. It's also craftable, so it's flexible in what kind of build you want to use it, and having the 2 4-pieces with max health on it is good as well. So despite there being a lot of others 1-barred weapon and spell damage sets or damage sets and altogether, this is still a good set that is worth considering despite it all. Burning Spellweave is yet again an old set that has withstood the test of time. Like Clever Alchemist, it's used when you want a short weapon or spell damage buff to make burst, but where in Clever Alchemist you will mostly put this on the back bar, this you will mostly put on the front bar with some offensive abilities, and I mostly see this being used on Dragonite specifically for having extra burst. But I must say, in my opinion, it's good but outperformed by some other sets later on as well. Then, Way of Fire. This is a proc set, a pressure proc set. It's one of the best sets to have a constant amount of pressure of small flame damage procs on the enemies, but it does require either regular light attacks like you would have on a ranged build, or some kind of weapon dot like Twin Slashes or Poison Injection, so that does limit the amount of builds it can be used on. But if you're looking for some extra pressure with your 5-piece set, this is one of the best ways to get it. Another really good way to get it is Serpent's Disdain. Status effects are an important part of most of the builds in the game, and there's a lot of status effects around, so having a good uptime on many of them is on one hand very valuable, but on the other hand also not that easy, especially on something like hemorrhaging. And this is something that Serpent's Disdain is going to solve. So if you only have a small chance to proc a certain stats effect, this is going to greatly increase its duration, meaning that you have a much easier time having a high uptime on all these valuable little buffs and debuffs, and thus have a lot of extra damage that you can do to the enemy. Rush of Agony is a set that I'm a bit unsure where to put. To be honest, it's mostly used by ball groups. They use it a lot to stack up enemies and then they can stun them again. It did get a nerf where you have a bit more time to react to it, but I have the impression that it is still being used. I may be wrong here, but since it used to be so important in ball group comps, I'm going to keep it here for now. Scavenging Demise is a really interesting set because it has one of the highest proc set tooltips in the game and it all comes in a singular burst as well. So this is really interesting when you can use it because it's going to deal equal or more damage than one of your burst skills even. But the problem is that the condition is a bit tricky. You need to use it on the build where you have some controllable form of poison damage and then still you have quite the telegraph before it's going to hit. So ideally you also combine this with a good CC in your build. And one of the examples where this could be used is on a Dragonite, where you have sources of poison damage that you can use and you have a really good CC with Fossilize or Shattering Rocks that you can use to more reliably hit this set. I also see this being used occasionally on sniper builds in combination with, for example, Celestrix, which is going to do the stun for you then, and then you have this set hit right afterwards. But in this case, it is more easily avoided by the enemies. Next up, I have a combination of 4 sets, being Powerful Assault, Transmutation, Villager's Prophet, and Spell Power Cure. All these 4 sets have the same purpose, which is to be a group support set that's going to give you extra damage or extra survivability to not just you, but as many group members as you want. And these are sets that you consider when you are making any kind of a rather large organized group setup. So everybody runs one of these sets and thus you can stack all these buffs together, which is the way that ball groups get all these buffs and is one of the ways that they also become so strong in PvP. Then I have kind of the opposite of the spectrum here with Essence Thief. Essence Thief is a set that is very good on paper. It's got high stat density, just a flat damage boost like this is really nice, and it also has a bunch of stam sustain. So on paper it's going to give you a lot of valuable buffs, but in practice it's mostly a dual set. You only really use it in 1v1s reliably, because there you have no problem picking up that buff when it runs away from you, but in open world very often you can't pick it up reliably. That might be due to, for example, needing to kite or due to terrain, having it reach a position where it is not optimal to go to. So it's a set worth considering. It can be one board, it's going to give you a lot of buffs, but you have to keep into account how this is going to work out in practice and how easy or difficult it is for you to get a good uptime with picking up the pools all the time. Then we have a set that I mentioned earlier, which is Phoenix Moth Turge. This is a buff set, which is going to give nice small buffs with minor force and minor courage, both for solo and for a support set in groups. This is worth considering, I think. You can one bar or pack bar this set as well, so that's valuable too. But if you want to have this set, you of course need to consider classes where you don't use Race Against Time or you don't have minor courage already either. Then Stuns. Stuns Favor is one of the options of penetration sets next to, for example, Spriggan and Spinners, what I mentioned earlier. But in this case it's going to be quite significantly more stat dense, which is why I listed higher on the list. But on the other hand, it does also require off balance, which means that you can't use it on every class. But still, there is plenty of use cases, such as for example on Dragonite, or when you use a Dizzying Swing build, or when you use certain scribing skills, which are also going to apply off balance. Due to the cooldown on off balance, you'll also not have a permanent uptime on this when you fight only a few enemies, but when you're outnumbered or when you know how to combine your bursts with the uptime of this set, this is worth considering on a build that can provide off balance. Due to the off balance cooldown, you'll have a higher uptime in open world or in battlegrounds compared to 1v1s or small fights, so do keep that into account when you want to use this set. If you fight in smaller fights or 1v1s, you have to be able to combine your burst with the proc of this set. Next up is Twice Fanged Serpent. This is another penetration set, but in this case it is a double barred medium armor set. It's a very easy requirement for uptime, so it can be used on a lot of builds, and it should be considered if you have a double barred set that you can slot and if you want to sacrifice that to having more damage. In that case, having the amount of penetration that it gives is one of the strongest buffs you can have. Daedric Trickery is an excellent one-bar buff/survivability set. It's going to give you a variety of strong buffs, and I see it mostly being used on Dragon Knights. So if you're looking for extra survivability and healing, this is worth considering. But as I mentioned before, there is also plenty of other healing options in the game right now, so I don't consider it a must-have, and that's the reason why I want to slot it in A tier and not higher than that. Relican, or Perfected Relican, is a set that is kind of similar to Twice Fanged Serpent, where this is a double bar medium armor damage set that you should consider if you have the room for it. But the condition in this case is a little trickier, with only light and heavy attacks giving it a good uptime. That means that you should only consider it if you have a range build, and the class or spec that I see this using the most is Bowsork, which uses this to get a lot of extra pressure from range. Another good way to get extra pressure is with Venomous Smite. This is a one-barred dot proc set, so this is something you should consider alongside, for example, Way of Fire, if you like pressure, and depending on which is easiest for you to use and to have a good uptime with, you can go for one or the other. Venomous Smite is something I see most often on, for example, bow blades, often in combination with other dot sets as well. Hrothgar is a front bar burst proc set. The damage isn't that high, especially when you compare to, for example, Scavenging Demise, but it's a lot easier to proc, and this condition is that it will proc together with a stun. And this is one of the best timings to have, since you often deal a high amount of burst together with a stun. That's what you aim for, because the enemy then can't heal himself as easily, they need to break free and everything. So even though the tooltip is not that high, the timing is really good, and if you're looking for just a little bit of extra burst, or for example a Warden, this is a good set to consider. Next up I have another duo of sets, in this case it is Titanborn and Truesworn Fury. These two sets are both good ganking sets. I've been listing and using these sets for years now, and they are still very valuable. It goes hand in hand with the Arterial Burst spawnable as well if you want to use that, and generally there are few other sets that are as that dense as this one. The big drawback is of course that you have to be below 50% health. I think when you run a ganking build, this is a sacrifice that is worth making, since you are not intending to take damage from anything else anyway. But if you have a problem with this, you should consider the sets that are listed earlier with Antelmir Cinders and Flame Blossom. Aldous Wrath is one of the best crit sets in the game. It's common to use this in both PvE and PvP, so if you have a crit build and you're looking to maximize both your crit chance and your crit damage, this is a really good set to consider. It's also craftable, so it's very versatile. And even though you should maybe consider some better sets, there are few builds where you're going to be making a mistake slotting this. And on that note, I also want to mention the Gourmand and Medusa sets. These are two similar sets which are also going to give crit chance or crit damage, which are also to be considered when you're looking to use your 5-piece sets to increase your damage on a crit build. Then we have Pariah. Pariah is a set that is very similar to something I mentioned in B tier, Buffer of the Swift. It is just a good double bar survivability set if you have the need and room for that, especially in nocp. This is something that I like to use a lot. But compared to Buffer of the Swift, I definitely prefer this one because there's also heavy armor. If I'm going to slot a survivability set, it's likely that I'm also going to slot heavy armor because I'm looking for extra survivability with my gear. So this is really going to be kind of a second undead for you, meaning that you get a lot of survivability, especially on low health. And then to finish off the A tier, I have two new class sets, which are not in the game right now, but they will be quite soon when the new patch drops. And those are the Templar and the Nightblade sets. I think those are worth considering. I'm listing them in A tier right now, as I don't know their exact value yet. Of course, I'm not able to test them. But I also did not want to ignore them, so I'm mentioning Umbral Edge, which is the Nightblade set, which is going to give you on-demand major vulnerability, which is a really strong debuff to have, and I think especially in small fights or duels this is worth considering. And then the Templar set is Aetheric Lancer, which is a proc set that looks like it's going to give Templars some extra burst. I quite like that because Templars, in my opinion, are not that strong, and one of the main things that they lack is burst. They have a very weak burst ability, one of the weakest in the game. And this might fix that a little bit for them, give them the opportunity to have more offensive capabilities and make them a bit better compared to the other classes as well. And then I arrive at the S tier, so here I have the best sets. These are sets that I'm going to use very frequently in a lot of builds for PvP, both for solo or group or anything like that are very stat dense or in other ways very useful, and that are also very common to find in PvP builds all across YouTube or any kind of website for PvP. And the first two sets that I 100% have to mention here, I'm going to do this together, as Rallying Cry and Rash Fatality. These two sets really deserve their own category, like an S++ or something, so I'm going to deal with these first. I believe that these two sets are really the most commonly found on any open world or battleground build, in CP cyrodiil of course, or in battlegrounds, not in nocp cyrodiil. And Rallying Cry specifically, I can also see a lot in groups being used, Rash Fatality not so much. I'm sure you're all familiar with these sets and I don't need to explain it. They're both 1-bar sets, which is a really good thing to have. They both give a lot of survivability. And then Rallying Cry is also going to give you a bunch of weapon and spell damage on top of that. And any build I make has one or both of these sets. I think it's also interesting that these are both defensive sets, survivability sets, meaning that very often you get your damage then through enchants if you run both of them, or the Mundus like the Shadow Mundus, or a specific monster set like Balorg. Or alternatively, you use one of these sets to get your survivability in order, and then you use the other one for a damage 5p set, of which I have also mentioned plenty in this video. Anyway, with those two out of the way, I'm going to move on to the rest of the S tier sets, and firstly we have Vicious Death and Plague Break. These are similar sets, they are bombing sets, they can be used both in a solo bombing build, or I also see them being used frequently in a group setup. These are really the sets that you need for any kind of large group fight. If you don't have these sets, you definitely have a noticeable drawback in your ability to perform in large-scale PvP, be it with a bomb blade or a ball group build or anything else like that. There is some difference between them, with Vicious Death being a smaller explosion with a higher tooltip, and Plague Break being a more of a long drawn out explosion that is also going to have a higher range than Vicious Death. So most often I see Vicious Death being used for singular sudden burst, and Plague Break more in constant group play, where you want to have longer chain reactions, or as soon as somebody explodes that a lot of people explode together. And of course it also makes it so that ball groups cannot use any kind of purge ability. Then Dark Conversions. This set fits right in the theme of fighting in large groups, be it outnumbered or not, and blowing up enemy groups. It's often also used in conjunction with Vicious Death or Plague Break in bombing builds. It's going to pull enemies into a single spot, which is really nice to get everybody in range of your bombing sets and your AoE abilities. And while it can be countered simply by blocking it, it's still very effective, and I also see it being used in group compositions at times. Then Shattered Fate. This is one of the best front bar sets, with the 5-piece giving a really high amount of penetration, which can often be lacking in builds. I've mentioned more straightforward front bar sets, and I've also mentioned more penetration sets, but when you are looking for a simple front bar damage set, this I think is one of the best, if not the best, option around in PvP right now. And that brings me nicely to Mechanical Acuity. This is another front bar set which I think is one of the best to consider for dealing extra damage, but this time it is with more specific requirements and mechanics than, for example, Shattered Fate. That also makes it so that not every class can use it. You need a lot of damage instances to get a long duration proc, which is most easily done on, for example, Templar and Dragon Knight, and I think especially for Templar this set is almost a must-have to give it some extra burst, which it critically lacks to perform well compared to other classes. Next up is Drogekin. If you have a build with a lot of stats effects, which is very often something you wish for anyway, or if you have a build with Crushing Shock as spammable, which is often together with stats effect, or a lot of dots like on a Dragon Knight, this is going to significantly increase your damage. Then a very similar set to this is Dragon's Appetite. It's a similar rationale, so if you have a lot of dots or a lot of stats effects, this is going to noticeably increase your damage, but it is required to have a bleed effect on the enemy, most often Twin Slashes, or for example the Warden's Fetcher Flies. But on the other hand, it's also going to increase your healing by giving you small heal procs pretty regularly, rather than reducing your healing, which is what Drogekin is going to do. And then lastly, I have another relatively new set, which is Tarnished Nightmare. This is a burst proc set that occurs when you deal critical damage and has a decent tooltip. The idea is that you further emphasize the burst you get with a good crit, and to me it seems that this is also one of the most popular front bar sets out there, considering the constant barrage of shattering glass sounds when I fight outnumbered, so I didn't want to miss out listing this one as a very good set as well. Anyway, that's it for this tier list. Let me know what you think of it. A lot of it I think is opinion in the end as well. I hope it's been valuable if you're looking to make your own build. I hope that if you have a different opinion here, you can always let me know and I will take that into account for any following tier lists, and other players that read the comments can also take your opinion into account when it comes to making their own build. I thank you very much for watching and I will see you next time. Bye!